It was a typical Wednesday evening in downtown Chicago, the kind where the summer heat lingered stubbornly in the air despite the setting sun. Sarah Mitchell stood on the crowded sidewalk, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her navy blue blazer. At 45, she carried herself with the confidence that came from 15 years as a senior marketing executive at Preston and Associates. The date had been particularly trying. A major client had pulled their account, and Sarah's carefully crafted presentation had fallen flat in front of the board. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was now slightly disheveled, and her patience had worn thinner than the soles of her expensive heels. She raised her hand to hail a taxi, watching as several yellow cabs whizzed past, already occupied. The digital clock on the bank building across the street blinked 6:45 p.m., reminding her she was already late for dinner with her teenage daughter, Emma. Finally, a taxi pulled up to the curb. Sarah reached for the door handle just as the driver stepped out to help her. Marcus Thompson, a man in his mid-30s wearing a clean, pressed white shirt and black slacks, moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing this job for years. "Good evening, ma'am. Let me help you with that," Marcus said, reaching for her briefcase. Sarah's body stiffened involuntarily. She pulled back slightly, her knuckles whitening around the handle of her bag. "I can manage," she said curtly, sliding into the back seat without making eye contact. Marcus's friendly smile faltered for a split second. He had seen that reaction before, many times in his 15 years of driving a taxi. Inside the cab, Sarah sat rigidly, her possessions gathered close. The taxi's interior was immaculate, with a small photo of a smiling family tucked into the corner of the dashboard. A fresh pine air freshener gently scented the air. "Where to, ma'am?" Marcus asked, his voice professional and steady as he adjusted his rearview mirror. His dark eyes met hers briefly in the reflection. 1542 Lakeshore Drive, Sarah replied, immediately pulling out her phone and pretending to be absorbed in emails. The screen's blue light illuminated her face in the darkening car. Marcus nodded and smoothly pulled away from the curb. "There's some traffic on Lakeshore Drive right now. Would you like me to take the alternate route through?" "Just take Lakeshore Drive," Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp. "I know the way to my own home." The car fell silent except for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional traffic update from the taxi's radio. Marcus focused on driving, occasionally checking his GPS to monitor the traffic situation. He'd learned long ago that some passengers preferred silence, though something about this woman's demeanor made him unusually uncomfortable. As they sat at a red light, Marcus noticed a car attempting to merge from a side street. With practiced courtesy, he waved them in. The driver, an elderly woman, smiled and waved back. Sarah watched this interaction in the reflection of her phone's screen, a slight frown creasing her forehead. The traffic grew heavier as they approached Lakeshore Drive. Marcus handled the car expertly, weaving through the congestion with smooth efficiency. Despite his skill, Sarah found herself gripping her seat slightly tighter whenever he changed lanes. "Should be about 15 more minutes with this traffic," Marcus commented, keeping his tone professional and friendly. "The Cubs game just let out, so everyone's heading home." Sarah merely nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced at her watch repeatedly, then out the window at the growing line of cars. Her foot tapped impatiently against the floor mat. The rest of the ride continued in tense silence. Marcus maintained his professional demeanor, though he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. In 15 years of driving, he'd developed a sixth sense about passengers, and something about this woman's behavior set off warning bells in his mind. As they finally pulled up to Sarah's elegant brownstone, the meter read $23.50. Sarah thrust $30 through the small window without a word and quickly exited the cab, leaving Marcus with a quiet "Have a good evening, ma'am," went unanswered. As he pulled away from the curb, Marcus took a deep breath and rolled his shoulders to release the tension that had built up during the ride. In his rearview mirror, he watched Sarah's figure disappear behind her front door, unaware that this seemingly routine fare would soon upend both their lives in ways neither could imagine. The morning after her taxi ride, Sarah sat at her glass desk in her home office, her laptop open in front of her. The early sunlight streamed through the large windows, but it did little to brighten her mood. She had spent a restless night, her mind repeatedly returning to the taxi ride, twisting and distorting the memories until they barely resembled reality. "Emma," Her 16-year-old daughter had already left for school, disappointed that her mother had been late for their dinner plans again. The guilt of disappointing Emma mixed with the lingering stress from yesterday's failed presentation, creating a toxic cocktail of emotions that needed an outlet. Sarah's manicured fingers hovered over her keyboard as she navigated to the taxi company's website. The complaint form was easy to find, a simple online document waiting to be filled with her version of events. She began typing, her fingers moving faster as her imagination took over. "Driver was inappropriate and made me feel unsafe," she wrote, pausing briefly before continuing. "He took unnecessary detours to increase the fare and made several unwanted attempts at conversation. His driving was erratic, and I feared for my safety." As she typed, Sarah's mind painted a different picture than what had actually occurred. Each keystroke added another layer to her fabricated story, transforming Marcus's professional courtesy into something sinister. She included his taxi number and the time of the ride, making the complaint official and specific. In another part of the city, Marcus was starting his morning shift. He pulled up to his regular coffee shop, where Maria, the elderly owner, had his usual order ready. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she called out cheerfully. "One black coffee and a blueberry muffin for my favorite customer." Marcus smiled, reaching for his wallet. "How's your grandson doing in college, Maria?" "Oh, he's doing wonderful. Just made the dean's list," she beamed, pushing an extra muffin across the counter. "For your little girl. How's she doing with those math problems?" "Getting better every day. These muffins are her motivation for finishing her homework." Marcus laughed, not knowing that at that very moment, Sarah was clicking the submit button on her complaint. By noon, the complaint had reached James Parker, the taxi company's supervisor. He frowned as he read through Sarah's detailed accusations. Marcus Thompson had been driving for the company for 15 years without a single complaint. In fact, he had received numerous commendations for his service. James picked up his phone and dialed Marcus's number. "Mr. Thompson, could you come to the office when you finish your current fare? There's a matter we need to discuss." Marcus felt his stomach tighten at the serious tone in James's voice. He finished dropping off his passenger and headed to the office, his mind racing through possible scenarios. Had something happened to his taxi permit? Was there a problem with his insurance? Meanwhile, Sarah sat in her office at Preston and Associates, trying to focus on her work. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Mom, can we talk about last night? You seemed really upset when you got home." Sarah ignored the message, but her daughter's concern made her stomach churn. She opened the confirmation email from the taxi company, reading it again. "Thank you for your complaint. We take all allegations seriously and will conduct a thorough investigation." Back at the taxi company office, Marcus sat stunned as James read the complaint to him. "This isn't true," he said quietly, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "None of this is true. I have GPS records. I took the most direct route. I barely spoke to her." James nodded sympathetically, but his expression remained grave. "I believe you, Marcus, but we have to follow protocol. Until we complete our investigation, we'll have to suspend your driving privilege." 2 days after filing her complaint, Sarah was in the middle of a meeting when her phone buzzed with a news alert. She nearly dropped her coffee cup when she saw the headline. "Local taxi driver suspended after passenger complaint. Community rallies behind him." Across town, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by bills and his daughter Lisa's medication prescriptions. His wife, Teresa, stood behind him, her hands gently massaging his tense shoulders. The local news website was open on his laptop, displaying a growing number of comments supporting him. "Dad, why aren't you driving today?" asked Lisa, their 12-year-old daughter, as she packed her backpack for school. Her innocent question made Marcus's heart ache. He hadn't told her about the suspension yet, trying to protect her from adult worries. "I'm taking a few days off, sweetheart," he replied, forcing a smile. Teresa squeezed his shoulders tighter, knowing how much the lie hurt him. They had already started dipping into their savings to cover Lisa's medical expenses. At the taxi company's office, James Parker was reviewing the security footage from Marcus's taxi. The camera had captured the entire ride clearly: Sarah's cold demeanor, Marcus's professional behavior, and the standard route taken. There was nothing to support her allegations, but company policy required a thorough investigation before reinstatement. The story had caught the attention of local media, particularly because Marcus was well known in the community. Regular passengers began sharing their positive experiences with reporters. Maria, the coffee shop owner, had even organized a small protest outside the taxi company headquarters. "He's driven my grandson to college every semester for 4 years," Maria told a reporter, holding a sign that read "Justice for Marcus." "That man is a saint. He even helps me carry my groceries when he sees me walking home." Sarah watched the news coverage from her office, her face growing pale. She hadn't expected her complaint to become public, hadn't thought about the ripple effects it would create. Her assistant knocked on her door, interrupting her thoughts. "Ms. Mitchell, there's a reporter from the Chicago Tribune asking for a comment about the taxi driver situation. They somehow found out you filed the complaint." Sarah's hands began to shake. "Tell them I have no comment," she snapped, quickly closing the news website on her computer. But the damage was already spreading. Back at Marcus's house, his phone kept buzzing with messages of support from regular customers. But kind words couldn't pay the bills. Teresa was already looking for part-time work, and they were considering pulling Lisa out of her after-school math program to save money. "Maybe I could deliver pizzas temporarily," Marcus suggested, sorting through job listings on his laptop. Teresa shook her head. "You've done nothing wrong," she insisted. "We should fight this." Meanwhile, the taxi company's investigation continued. James interviewed other passengers who had ridden with Marcus that day. A young college student who had taken Marcus's taxi right after Sarah came forward with her statement. "He was super professional," the student told James. "He even helped me find my lost phone before I left the cab. Doesn't sound like someone who would harass anybody." The security footage was being analyzed by the company's legal team. Every minute of Sarah's ride was scrutinized, revealing nothing but a standard trip with a clearly uncomfortable passenger. At home that evening, Sarah's daughter Emma confronted her. "Mom, isn't that the taxi you took the other night? The one you were so upset about?" Sarah avoided her daughter's questioning gaze. "I don't want to talk about it, Emma." "But Mom, they're saying his daughter is sick and needs medicine, if he didn't do anything wrong." "I said I don't want to talk about it," Sarah snapped, immediately regretting her tone as hurt flashed across Emma's face. That night, neither Sarah nor Marcus could sleep. Marcus lay awake, worried about his family's future, while Sarah tossed and turned, haunted by the consequences of her actions. The security footage showing the truth sat waiting in James's office like a ticking time bomb ready to expose her lies. The fallout was spreading wider than Sarah had ever imagined, affecting not just Marcus and his family, but rippling through the community, forcing people to take sides, and slowly but surely, making its way back to her own carefully constructed world. The fourth day after the complaint brought unexpected developments. Jennifer Chen, a young software engineer, sat nervously in James Parker's office at the taxi company. She clutched her phone tightly, which contained a video that would change everything. "I was his next passenger that day, right after that woman," Jennifer explained, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "I always record my rides for safety, and I think you need to see this." James leaned forward as Jennifer played the video. In it, Marcus could be seen adjusting his rearview mirror, his eyes showing obvious distress. His phone rang, and the video captured his side of the conversation with Teresa about Lisa's medicine. The timestamp clearly showed this was minutes after Sarah's ride. "He was nothing but professional," Jennifer continued. "When I asked if he was okay, he just said he'd had a difficult passenger. He didn't even complain or say anything negative about her." Across town, Sarah's workplace was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Whispers followed her through the corridor. The morning after Jennifer Chen's video went public, Sarah sat frozen in her home office, staring at her reflection in the dark computer screen. Her perfectly maintained facade was cracking. The local news had just released her name, and her phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages and missed calls. Emma stood in the doorway, her school bag clutched tightly against her chest. "Mom, we need to talk about this," she said, her voice trembling. "My friends are sharing the story on social media. They're saying horrible things about you." Sarah turned slowly to face her daughter, seeing not just disappointment but something worse, shame, in Emma's eyes. The teenager pulled out her phone and opened an article showing Marcus's family photo. Him, Teresa, and Lisa standing in front of their modest home, their smiles bright despite their obvious worry. Lisa is in my math club, Mom, Emma said quietly. She missed yesterday's meeting because they couldn't afford the program anymore. Did you know that when you made up those lies about her dad? The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She hadn't known, hadn't wanted to know, anything about the man she had accused. Now her own daughter was forcing her to see the full picture of what she had done. I didn't. Sarah began, but Emma cut her off. What exactly didn't you do, Mom? Didn't think? Didn't care? Or didn't think you'd get caught? Emma's voice cracked. My friends are asking me if we're racist. Are we, Mom? Sarah flinched at the question. She looked at her daughter, really looked at her for the first time in days. Emma's face was streaked with tears, her normally confident posture crumpled under the weight of her mother's actions. Meanwhile, at Preston and Associates, Sarah's assistant had placed another resignation letter on her desk. 3 team members had quit this morning, citing ethical concerns about working under her leadership. The company's CEO had requested an urgent meeting for that afternoon. Sarah's phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her own mother. I raised you better than this, it read simply. The words made her chest tight. She opened her laptop, forcing herself to read the latest news coverage. There was Marcus, speaking to reporters outside his house. I just want to get back to work, he said dignifiedly. My family needs me to provide for them. The camera panned to Lisa, who was holding a sign that read, My dad is a hero. Sarah noticed the girl's medical alert bracelet, visible as she waved to the cameras. Another piece of reality she had chosen to ignore. Mom, Emma said, still standing in the doorway. Remember last year when you told me about your friend Janet in college? How someone had accused her of cheating just because they didn't like that she was top of the class. You were so angry about the injustice. How is this any different? Sarah's carefully constructed justifications began to crumble. She remembered her own righteous anger when Janet, her black roommate, had faced false accusations. She had stood up for Janet then, had seen the pain those lies had caused. Now she had become the very thing she had once despised. Her computer chimed with an email from the taxi company's legal department, requesting a formal meeting. The subject line read, Security footage review and witness statement. Urgent response required. Emma walked over and placed her phone on her mother's desk, showing a social media post. It was a side-by-side comparison, the security footage showing Marcus's professional behavior and Sarah's written complaint full of fabrications. I have to go to school now, Emma said quietly. But when I come home, I need you to explain to me why you did this. And Mom, I need the truth this time. As Emma's footsteps faded down the hallway, Sarah stared at her reflection in the window. She saw herself clearly for the first time since this began, not as a victim, not as a professional woman being cautious, but as someone who had allowed her prejudices to nearly destroy an innocent man's life. The mirror had been held up, and Sarah couldn't look away anymore. Her reflection showed her something she had been running from her entire life. Her own bias, her own prejudice, her own failure to see people as people rather than through the lens of her preconceptions. The taxi company's conference room felt impossibly small as Sarah sat facing James Parker and the legal team. Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably beside her as the security footage played on the large screen, showing every moment of her ride with Marcus. Ms. Mitchell, James began, his voice steady but stern. As you can see, there is no evidence to support any of your allegations. In fact, we have quite the opposite. Sarah watched herself on the screen, saw her own cold demeanor, her dismissive responses to Marcus's professional courtesy. The timestamp showed the standard route, matching perfectly with GPS records. Her lies seemed paper-thin in the harsh light of evidence. I want to withdraw my complaint, Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to tell the truth. Across town, Marcus was finally back at work, his suspension lifted pending the investigation's conclusion. His first passenger of the day was Maria, the coffee shop owner, who insisted on riding in his taxi just to show her support. The truth always comes out, Mr. Thompson, Maria said, patting his shoulder. Always. Back in the conference room, Sarah began her confession. I made assumptions about Mr. Thompson based on his race, she admitted, the words bitter in her mouth. I let my prejudices guide my actions, and I filed a false complaint. The lawyer beside her stiffened, but Sarah continued. She needed to say everything, to finally speak the truth that her daughter had forced her to face. "I'd had a bad day at work," she explained, her voice growing stronger. "When I saw Mr. Thompson, I let all my preconceptions take over. He did absolutely nothing wrong. In fact, he was professional and courteous despite my rude behavior." James Parker leaned forward. "You understand the seriousness of filing a false complaint, the damage it's caused to Mr. Thompson and his family." Sarah nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "I've seen the news coverage. I know about his daughter's medical needs, about their financial struggles because of my actions. I want to make this right." Meanwhile, at Marcus's house, Teresa was reading the latest email from Lisa's doctor. The missed treatments during Marcus's suspension had caused setbacks in her condition. They would need extra sessions to make up for lost time. Back at the taxi company, Sarah was signing a formal retraction of her complaint. Her hands shook as she wrote a statement acknowledging her lies and apologizing for her actions. "We'll need this to be public," James explained. "The damage to Mr. Thompson's reputation was public, so the retraction needs to be as well." Sarah agreed without hesitation. "I'll speak to the press. I'll tell them everything. Mr. Thompson deserves that much." As she left the meeting, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from Emma. "Did you do it? Did you tell the truth?" "Yes," Sarah typed back, her vision blurring with tears. "I told everything." That evening, the local news station broke the story. Sarah's retraction was headline news, her tearful confession playing on screens across the city. She held nothing back, admitting to her prejudices, her lies, and the damage she had caused. Marcus watched the broadcast with his family, Teresa holding his hand tightly. Lisa looked up from her homework, studying her father's face as Sarah's confession played out. "She's sorry, Dad," Lisa said simply, "really sorry." Marcus nodded slowly. The anger and hurt were still there, but something else was too, a glimmer of respect for someone willing to admit their mistakes so publicly. At home, Emma watched the same broadcast with her mother, their hands clasped together on the couch. When Sarah's confession ended, Emma turned to her. "It was brave," she said quietly, "telling the truth like that." Sarah shook her head. "It wasn't brave. It was necessary. It was right." She squeezed her daughter's hand. "I'm just sorry it took me so long to do it." The truth was out now, floating in the open air of public confession. It couldn't undo the damage, couldn't erase the days of stress and worry, couldn't make up for Lisa's missed treatments. But it was a start, a first step toward making things right, toward changing not just actions but hearts and minds. A week after Sarah's public confession, she stood nervously outside the community center. Inside, a meeting of the local anti-discrimination coalition was about to begin. She had asked to speak, to share her story as a cautionary tale. Before entering, she checked her phone one last time. There was a message from Emma. "Proud of you, Mom. Lisa says thank you for the math club scholarship." Sarah had anonymously paid for not just Lisa's fees, but for 5 other students as well. Inside the meeting room, faces turned to watch her walk in. Some showed surprise, others skepticism. Sarah recognized Maria from the coffee shop, sitting in the front row with her arms crossed. Marcus's wife Teresa sat quietly in the back corner, having agreed to attend after Sarah's letter requesting to make amends. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "And I'm here to talk about how prejudice nearly destroyed an innocent man's life, and how it destroyed something in me too." As Sarah spoke, she noticed Teresa uncrossing her arms, leaning forward slightly. The room grew silent as she detailed her journey from that fateful taxi ride to her moment of truth. "I didn't just hurt Mr. Thompson and his family," Sarah continued. "I hurt our entire community. I reinforced stereotypes. I made it harder for the next person who faces real harassment to be believed." Meanwhile, across town, Marcus was driving his taxi, having returned to his regular route. His customers had doubled since the incident, many specifically requesting him as their driver. Today, he had a special passenger, Emma, Sarah's daughter, who had asked to speak with him privately. "My mom is speaking at the coalition meeting today," Emma explained. "But I wanted to talk to you myself, to apologize for what my family did to yours." Marcus listened quietly as the teenager spoke, seeing the same courage it had taken her mother to face the truth. "Your mother is trying to make things right," he said finally. "That counts for something." Back at the community center, Sarah was concluding her speech. I can't undo what I did, she said, but I can work to ensure it never happens to anyone else. I've established a fund at the taxi company to help drivers who face false accusations. I'm working with civil rights organizations to develop training programs about racial bias. Teresa stood up suddenly, all eyes turning to her. My husband is a good man, she said, her voice firm. He's been driving taxis for 15 years, helping people, caring for our daughter, never complaining even when people treat him badly. Your lies hurt us deeply. Sarah nodded, accepting the words. Yes, they did, and I'm so sorry. But Teresa continued, you're here, you're trying to make it right. That's more than most people would do. After the meeting, Sarah approached Teresa cautiously. There's something else I'd like to do, she said, pulling out an envelope. This is for Lisa's medical expenses. It's not charity, it's restitution. Teresa studied the envelope for a long moment before accepting it. Marcus and I have talked, she said finally. He's willing to meet with you. Not today, but soon. Across the city, Emma was getting out of Marcus's taxi. Your daughter is lucky to have you as a father, she said. And I'm learning to be a better person because of what happened. Marcus smiled gently. Sometimes the hardest lessons teach us the most important things. That evening, Sarah sat with Emma in their living room, sharing pizza and talking about the day's events. Mom, Emma said suddenly, remember when I asked if we were racist? Sarah set down her slice, giving her daughter her full attention. Yes, I remember. I think maybe we were, but we're learning not to be, right? Sarah hugged her daughter tightly. Yes, sweetheart. We're learning. Every day. Her phone buzzed with a message from Teresa, sharing a photo of Lisa back at math club, smiling brightly. Another message followed. Marcus agrees to meet next week. He says to bring Emma too. It's time for healing. Sarah showed the messages to Emma, both of them feeling the weight of their actions but also the possibility of redemption. The path to making amends was long, but they had taken the first steps together, mother and daughter, learning and growing through their mistakes. 1 month later, Marcus and Sarah sat across from each other at a small table in the community center's meeting room. A professional mediator named David sat between them, while Emma, Teresa, and Lisa waited in the adjoining room. Thank you for agreeing to meet, Sarah began, her hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup of coffee. The steam rose between them like a thin barrier. Marcus nodded slowly. I wanted to understand, he said quietly. Not just what happened that day, but why it happened. The mediator guided them through their conversation. Sarah spoke first, explaining her background, her upbringing in a predominantly white suburb, and her realization of how deeply ingrained her prejudices had been. I never thought of myself as prejudiced, she admitted. I had black colleagues, I donated to civil rights causes. But that day in your taxi, I let fear and bias override everything else. Marcus listened intently, his hands folded on the table. When it was his turn to speak, his voice was steady but emotional. Every day, I face small prejudices, he explained. People who won't make eye contact, women who clutch their purses tighter. But your complaint, that could have destroyed everything I've worked for. In the next room, Emma and Lisa had started talking, finding common ground in their shared experience at math club. Teresa watched the two girls, seeing hope in their easy friendship. Back in the meeting room, Marcus continued. I've been driving taxis for 15 years. Put my wife through nursing school. Got Lisa the medical care she needs. All of that was at risk because of assumptions you made about me in those few minutes. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. I know, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it. I don't want your guilt, Marcus said firmly. I want your understanding. I want you to really see what happens when people let prejudice guide their actions. David, the mediator, guided them toward constructive dialogue. They talked about their families, their hopes for their children, their daily struggles and joys. Lisa told me about the math club scholarship, Marcus said, and about how Emma stood up for her when some kids were talking about the incident. Sarah smiled softly. Emma taught me as much as I taught her through all this, maybe more. As their conversation deepened, Teresa and the girls joined them. Lisa showed Sarah her latest math test score, beaming with pride. Emma's been helping me study, she explained. The two families shared stories, finding unexpected connections and common ground. Teresa talked about her nursing career, and Sarah spoke about her own mother's battle with illness. They discovered their children shared the same favorite books and dreams of becoming scientists. "Would you consider," Marcus said carefully, "speaking with me at the taxi company's driver training sessions, sharing our story? It might help prevent something like this from happening again." Sarah agreed immediately. "I'd be honored. And I'd like to continue working with the Anti-Discrimination Coalition, if you're comfortable with that." As the meeting drew to a close, Marcus extended his hand across the table. Sarah took it, feeling the weight of the moment. "I don't forget," Marcus said honestly, "but I forgive. Because holding on to anger changes nothing, but understanding can change everything." Outside the community center, the families parted ways with plans to meet again. Emma and Lisa exchanged phone numbers, making plans to study together. Teresa and Sarah scheduled coffee to discuss their shared interest in community outreach programs. That evening, Sarah wrote in her journal, "Understanding comes at a price. Sometimes that price is facing our own worst selves. The cost of not understanding, of letting prejudice rule our actions, is far greater." Marcus drove his last fare of the day, a young black woman who recognized him from the news story. "You changed things," she told him. "Your story made people think twice." At home, he helped Lisa with her homework while Teresa prepared dinner. The weight of what had happened would always be part of their story, but it no longer defined their days. The understanding reached between two families had created ripples of change throughout their community. It wasn't a perfect ending, real life rarely has those. But it was a new beginning, built on truth, forgiveness, and the shared hope for a better future.